The candles in the ballroom burned bright, but nothing burned hotter than the shame spreading across Clara Bennett's face. Julian Ashford, Duke of Wren, had just said the words loud enough for every guest near the marble staircase to hear them. He looked directly at her when he said them, as if she were an exhibit at a museum rather than a woman standing 3 feet away in a borrowed gown. "I would never marry a woman like her," he said, his voice smooth and careless, the kind of voice that had never once worried about consequences. "She has no fortune, no name worth mentioning, and no place in a house like mine." Laughter rippled through the small circle of lords and ladies around him. Clara's hands closed into fists at her sides, hidden by the folds of her skirt. She did not cry. She refused to give him that. Her mother, Margaret Bennett, stood a few steps away, her face pale as chalk. The Bennett family had come to this ball for one reason only, to secure some connection, any connection, that might save them from the debts pressing down on their small estate like a collapsing roof. Clara's father had died 2 years earlier, leaving behind unpaid accounts and a house that grew colder every winter because there was no money for coal. Margaret had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that tonight might open a door. Instead, the Duke had slammed one shut in front of the entire room. Clara lifted her chin. She would not run from the ballroom in tears, though every part of her wanted to. Instead, she turned, calmly, and walked toward the terrace doors, her steps steady despite the trembling in her chest. Behind her, she heard Julian's low chuckle join the others, and the sound of it settled into her memory like a stone dropped into still water, sinking deep, impossible to retrieve. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean. Clara gripped the stone railing of the terrace and breathed slowly, forcing her pulse to calm. She had heard worse things said about her family before. She had grown used to whispers about their reduced circumstances, about her father's failed investments, about the way her mother now sewed her own gowns instead of buying them. But never had anyone said such words directly to her face, with her standing close enough to see the amusement in his eyes. A woman like her, as if she were a category, not a person, as if her worth could be measured by the size of her dowry and nothing else. She thought of her younger sister Alice, waiting at home with a fever that would not break, and of the doctor's bill still unpaid on the kitchen table. She thought of the quiet, desperate hope her mother carried into every social gathering, hoping that someone, anyone, might offer them a way forward. And she thought of the Duke's careless laughter, so easy, so thoughtless, because nothing in his gilded life had ever forced him to consider what it meant to go without. Clara did not know, standing there in the cold night air with her pride bruised but not broken, that fate had already begun weaving her life into his. She only knew that she hated him, cleanly and completely, and that she intended to prove him wrong about everything he believed about a woman like her. Inside, Julian Ashford accepted a glass of wine from a passing servant, and told himself he had done nothing wrong. He had simply spoken the truth. He was a duke. He would marry a woman of proper standing, someone who understood the weight of the Ashford name, someone who would not embarrass him in front of his peers. Clara Bennett, with her plain gown and her family's mounting debts, was simply not a suitable match, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. And yet, even as he told himself this, something about the way she had walked away stayed with him. She had not wept. She had not begged. She had simply turned and left, her spine straight, her head high, as though his words were beneath her notice rather than a wound. It irritated him more than he wanted to admit. His friend, Edmund Caro, leaned close and murmured that perhaps he had been too harsh. Julian waved the comment away. Harsh or not, he said, it was the truth. And the truth rarely felt kind. Across the ballroom, a woman named Vivian Thorne watched the entire exchange with quiet satisfaction. Lady Vivian had set her sights on the Duke of Wren for over a year, calculating every move with the precision of a chess player. She had no interest in Clara Bennett as a rival, not truly, not yet. But she filed away the humiliation she had just witnessed, as something that might prove useful later. A woman publicly shamed by a duke rarely recovered her standing, and Vivian intended to make certain Clara never did. 3 weeks passed. The Bennett family's situation grew more desperate with each passing day. The bank sent a second letter demanding payment on the mortgage, and Margaret Bennett sat at the kitchen table late into the night, staring at numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times she recalculated them. Clara watched her mother's shoulders grow more stooped, her face more tired, and she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would seek employment. It was not a common choice for a woman of her background, but the Bennett family had little pride left to protect. Clara had always possessed a sharp mind for numbers, a skill she had learned from her father before his death, back when he still managed the estate's accounts himself and let her sit beside him at the desk. showing her how columns of figures told a story if you knew how to read them. She had heard, through a distant cousin, that a household in the county was seeking someone to help manage its accounts, a position usually reserved for a steward, but the family in question was willing to consider anyone with proven skill, regardless of gender, given the disarray their previous steward had left behind. Clara wrote a letter of inquiry that very night, careful to present her skills plainly and without exaggeration. She sealed it before she could talk herself out of sending it, and the next morning she walked it to the post herself, her breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. And she did not know, when she sent that letter, which household it belonged to. She did not yet know that fate, cruel and clever, had arranged for her path to cross again with the very man who had humiliated her in front of an entire ballroom. The reply came faster than she expected, written in a firm, elegant hand. The household was in need of someone immediately. She was invited to begin within the week. Clara read the letter twice, her heart lifting slightly for the first time in weeks. A position meant income. Income meant her mother could stop lying awake at night. It meant Alice could see a proper doctor. It meant, perhaps, that the Bennett family might survive this winter after all. She did not think to ask, in her relief, whose household she would be entering. It was only when the carriage that had been sent to collect her turned up the long drive toward a grand stone house, its towers rising against the gray morning sky, that Clara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. She recognized the crest on the gate before the carriage had even come to a full stop. Wren Hall, the Duke's estate. Clara sat frozen in the carriage seat for a long moment, her gloved hands pressed together in her lap. She could refuse. She could ask the driver to turn back, could write an apologetic letter explaining that she had made an error, could return home and continue searching for another position, one that did not require her to spend her days in the household of the man who had called her unworthy in front of half the county. But the mortgage letter sitting on her mother's kitchen table did not care about pride. Alice's fever did not care about humiliation. Clara closed her eyes, breathed once, deeply, and stepped down from the carriage when it stopped before the towering front doors of Wren Hall. She would take the position. She would prove, every single day she worked within these walls, that Julian Ashford had been wrong about her, and she would never, not for one moment, let him see how much his words had wounded her. The housekeeper who greeted her, a stout, kind-faced woman named Louisa Pratt, seemed unaware of any connection between Clara and the ballroom incident. She led Clara through a maze of corridors, explaining the state of the household accounts with visible relief that someone competent had finally arrived to sort them out. The previous steward, it seemed, had left in disgrace after years of careless record-keeping, and the estate's finances were in a worse state than anyone outside the family realized. Clara was shown to a small study near the back of the house, its shelves lined with ledgers stacked in disorganized piles. She set down her bag and began, almost immediately, to work, grateful for the distraction the numbers provided. For nearly 2 hours she lost herself in columns of figures, cross-referencing dates, correcting obvious errors, building a picture of an estate that had been slowly bleeding money through neglect, rather than any true financial crisis. She did not hear the study door open. She did not notice the tall figure standing in the doorway until he spoke. "You are the new steward," he said, and Clara's blood turned to ice at the sound of that voice. She looked up slowly. Julian Ashford stood framed in the doorway, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to open shock as recognition dawned across his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable, filled with everything that had passed between them 3 weeks earlier. "Miss Bennett," he finally said, his voice careful now, stripped of the careless amusement it had carried at the ball. "Your Grace," Clara replied, rising from her chair and offering the smallest, coldest curtsy she could manage while still remaining polite. "I did not realize this was your household when I accepted the position. If you would prefer I leave, I understand completely." Something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite name. He glanced at the ledgers spread across the desk, at the corrections already marked in her neat, careful hand, at the evidence of 2 hours of skilled, focused work accomplished while he had been out riding the estate grounds, entirely unaware that the woman he had publicly humiliated was sitting in his own study, quietly fixing the mess his negligent steward had left behind. "No," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Stay. The accounts need attention, and you clearly know what you are doing." Clara studied him for a moment, searching for mockery in his expression and finding none. Only a kind of uncertain surprise, as though he did not quite know what to make of this situation any more than she did. "Very well," she said, and sat back down, picking up her pen with hands that did not shake, though her heart pounded fiercely beneath her composed exterior. Julian lingered in the doorway a moment longer before turning and walking away without another word. Clara did not watch him go. She kept her eyes fixed on the ledger before her, forcing herself to focus on the numbers rather than the storm of feelings churning inside her chest. She had come to Wren Hall to earn wages for her family, nothing more. She would not let the Duke's presence distract her from that purpose, no matter how strange and complicated fate had suddenly made her life. Outside the study, Julian stood in the corridor for a long moment, his mind turning over what had just happened. He had spoken carelessly at that ball, he could admit that much to himself now, standing alone in the quiet hallway with no audience to perform for. He had not truly considered Clara Bennett as a person when he said those words, only as a symbol of everything he had been taught to avoid, a reminder of the kind of match his family expected him to reject. But the woman sitting in his study, sleeves slightly rolled, ink staining her fingers, working through his estate's tangled finances with obvious skill and quiet determination, did not match the careless dismissal he had spoken at the ball. She was sharper than he had given her credit for, and something about her calm refusal to be intimidated by his presence unsettled him in a way he did not fully understand. He told himself it meant nothing. She was simply an employee, a temporary solution to a financial problem, nothing more. But as he walked away down the long corridor, he found himself already wondering what tomorrow would bring, and whether she would still be there, sitting quietly at his desk, proving him wrong with every careful column of figures she corrected. Neither of them spoke of the ballroom again that evening, but the memory of it sat between them, unspoken and heavy, a shadow that would follow them through every conversation still to come. The following morning, Clara arrived at Wren Hall before the sun had fully risen, determined to establish a routine that kept her far from any unnecessary contact with the Duke. She entered through the servants' door as Louisa Pratt had instructed, made her way quietly to the study, and buried herself in the ledgers before the household had properly woken. For nearly a week, this arrangement worked well enough. Julian left early each morning to inspect the tenant farms or ride out with his steward's remaining staff, and Clara worked steadily through the tangled accounts, uncovering discrepancy after discrepancy left behind by the previous steward's carelessness. She discovered unpaid invoices hidden beneath stacks of unrelated papers, tenant rents recorded twice in some months and not at all in others, and a troubling pattern of payments made to a merchant in the nearby town that did not match any goods delivered to the estate. She began keeping a separate notebook, documenting each irregularity with careful precision, building a case she intended to present clearly and without emotion, the same way she had learned to present arguments from her father, who had always told her that facts spoke louder than feelings when it came to matters of business. It was on the 8th day that circumstances forced her into closer proximity with the Duke than she had managed to avoid until then. She had discovered something troubling in the ledgers, a pattern of payments to the merchant that seemed to increase suspiciously whenever the previous steward's signature appeared beside them, and she needed the Duke's authorization to investigate further, since the matter involved contacting the merchant directly to request receipts. She found him in his study, a different room from the one she worked in, larger and lined with books rather than ledgers. He looked up when she knocked, surprise flickering across his face at the sight of her standing in his doorway. "Your Grace," she said, holding up her notebook, "I have found something in the accounts that requires your attention." He gestured her inside, and she approached his desk, laying out the pages she had prepared, explaining each discrepancy in clear, measured terms. As she spoke, she noticed him leaning forward slightly, his earlier distraction replaced by genuine focus, his eyes moving carefully over the figures she presented. "This is theft," he said finally, his voice hard. "I believe so, yes," Clara replied. "Your previous steward appears to have been recording false purchases and pocketing the difference. The pattern has continued for at least 2 years, based on what I have found so far." Julian sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that struck Clara as surprisingly human, stripped of the careless arrogance she remembered from the ballroom. "How much?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated, then named a sum that made his jaw tighten. It was not a fortune large enough to ruin a duke, but it was substantial enough to explain much of the financial strain the estate had been under, strain that had trickled down into delayed wages for tenant farmers and neglected repairs on cottages across the property. "I want this resolved," Julian said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes, contact the merchant, gather what evidence you can, and bring it to me. I will see the man who did this held accountable." Clara nodded, gathering her papers. As she turned to leave, Julian spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Miss Bennett." I think she paused at the door, glancing back. "Thank you," he said, genuinely. "I did not expect anyone to uncover this so quickly, or to care enough to look this closely in the first place." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the mockery she had grown accustomed to expecting from him, and finding, instead, only sincerity. "It is my work," she said simply, and left the room before he could see how his words had affected her more than she wanted to admit. Over the following weeks, their interactions grew more frequent, though never less formal. Julian began stopping by the small study each afternoon, ostensibly to review her progress on the accounts, though Clara noticed the visits grew longer than strictly necessary, the conversations drifting occasionally beyond matters of business into subjects neither of them had intended to discuss. She learned, in fragments, about his childhood, about a father who had drilled into him from a young age the importance of protecting the Ashford name above all else, about a mother who had died when he was young enough that he barely remembered her voice. She learned that his careless words at the ball had not come from cruelty exactly, but from a lifetime spent being taught that his choices, even his marriage, existed to serve the family legacy rather than his own heart. He learned, in turn, about her father's death, about the debts left behind, about her mother's quiet desperation, and her sister's ongoing illness. He learned that Clara had taught herself to manage accounts not because any tutor had trained her for it, but because necessity had forced her to learn quickly, sitting up late at night with her father's old ledgers, teaching herself the language of numbers because no one else in her family understood it well enough to keep them from ruin. Neither of them named what was happening between them, but something had shifted, subtly and undeniably, in the weeks since Clara had first walked through the doors of Wren Hall. The careless Duke who had humiliated her at that ball seemed, more and more, like a different person entirely from the man who now sought her opinion on estate matters, who listened when she spoke, who seemed, increasingly, to seek out her company even when no ledger required his attention. Louisa Pratt noticed it first, the way the Duke's mood lightened whenever Miss Bennet was expected, the way he lingered near the study door on afternoons when accounts were the farthest thing from his mind. She said nothing to anyone, but she watched with quiet interest, remembering old stories about how love sometimes arrived disguised as the last thing anyone expected. It was on a rainy afternoon, nearly a month into Clara's employment, that the fragile balance between them shifted further still. A crisis erupted in the servants' quarters, a young maid named Charlotte accused by another servant of stealing a piece of jewelry from a guest room. The accusation spread through the household quickly, and by the time Clara heard of it, Charlotte was already in tears, standing before the housekeeper, insisting on her innocence while the accusing servant grew louder and more certain with every retelling. Clara, who had worked closely enough with the household staff over the past weeks to know Charlotte's character, did not believe the accusation for a moment. She set aside her ledgers and went to investigate, asking careful questions, tracing the timeline of who had access to the guest room and when, until she discovered that the jewelry in question had simply been misplaced by the guest herself, tucked into a travel case rather than left on the dressing table as the guest had originally claimed. She presented her findings calmly to the housekeeper, then to the Duke himself, who happened to be present when the matter reached its conclusion. Charlotte was cleared entirely, the true accusing servant reprimanded for spreading false claims out of jealousy over a promotion Charlotte had recently received, and the household returned to order within the hour, thanks entirely to Clara's careful, patient investigation. Julian watched the entire situation unfold with growing admiration. He had seen Clara handle numbers with skill, but this was something different, a demonstration of fairness and quiet courage that impressed him more deeply than any ledger correction ever could. She had defended a servant girl with no power or standing, simply because it was right, without any expectation of reward or recognition. That evening, he found her again in the small study, preparing to leave for the day. "Miss Bennet," he said, and she turned, surprised to see him there so late. "What you did today, for Charlotte," he continued, "that was well done. Better than well done. Many people in your position would have avoided the trouble entirely." Clara considered his words carefully before answering. "I could not stand by and let an innocent girl suffer for something she did not do," she said. "That would have made me no better than anyone who ever judged me unfairly." The words landed between them with unmistakable weight, and Julian's expression shifted, something like understanding, or perhaps regret, passing across his face. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "For what I said, that night at the ball, it was cruel and untrue, and I have thought of it more often than I care to admit since you arrived here." Clara's breath caught slightly in her throat. She had not expected an apology, had told herself weeks ago that she did not need one, that she had built her own quiet strength without requiring his acknowledgement of the wound he had caused. And yet, hearing the words spoken sincerely, without any audience to perform for, something in her chest loosened slightly, a tension she had carried since that night finally beginning to ease. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to find any other words adequate to the moment. They stood there a while longer, the rain tapping softly against the windows, neither of them quite ready to end the conversation, though neither knew what more there was to say. Eventually, Clara gathered her things and bid him good night, and Julian watched her go, aware, more clearly than he had ever been about anything, that his feelings toward Clara Bennett had grown into something far more complicated than he had ever anticipated when he first spoke those careless words at the ball. He did not yet know how difficult the road ahead would prove to be. Lady Vivian Thorne, watching from a distance, had already begun setting her plans into motion, plans that would soon threaten everything quietly growing between the Duke and the steward he had once so publicly dismissed. Lady Vivian Thorne had not survived years of careful social maneuvering by acting rashly, and she did not intend to start now. She had watched from a careful distance as rumors trickled back to her about the Duke's steward, a woman named Clara Bennett, the very same woman he had so publicly humiliated at the ball weeks earlier. At first, Vivian had dismissed the rumors as meaningless gossip, servants exaggerating small kindnesses into something more dramatic than they truly were. But as the weeks passed and the rumors persisted, growing more detailed with each retelling, Vivian began to understand that something real was happening at Wren Hall, something that threatened everything she had spent over a year carefully building toward. She invited herself to tea with the Duke's aunt, Lady Eleanor Ashford, a sharp-eyed dowager who lived in a smaller house on the edge of the estate and who saw far more of the household's daily affairs than most people realized. Lady Eleanor, though fond of her nephew, had never much cared for Vivian's calculated charm, but propriety demanded she receive the visit regardless. Vivian steered the conversation carefully toward Wren Hall, mentioning offhandedly that she had heard the Duke's accounts were finally being properly managed. Lady Eleanor, who genuinely admired Clara's work and had grown fond of the young woman during several visits to the estate, spoke warmly of her competence, her fairness with the household staff, and, though she did not intend to reveal quite so much, the obvious change in Julian's temperament since Clara's arrival. "He smiles more," Lady Eleanor said, sipping her tea with the satisfied air of someone who believed she was simply making pleasant conversation. "He used to be so serious, so consumed with duty. Now he seems almost like a different man." Vivian smiled thinly and changed the subject, but inside, something cold and calculating had settled into place. She understood immediately what Lady Eleanor's innocent words truly meant. The Duke was falling for his own steward, a woman of no fortune and no standing, a woman he had once declared, in front of the entire county, that he would never marry. If this continued unchecked, Vivian's carefully constructed plans for her own future would collapse entirely. She began quietly gathering information, speaking with servants she had cultivated relationships with over the years, learning the details of Clara's daily routine, her family's circumstances, the debts that had driven her to seek employment in the first place. Vivian was patient. She did not act immediately. Instead, she waited, watching for the right moment, the right weakness to exploit. Meanwhile, at Wren Hall, the bond between Julian and Clara continued to deepen, though both of them remained careful to maintain proper boundaries, aware of how quickly gossip could destroy a reputation, particularly a woman's reputation, should their growing closeness become public knowledge. Clara had made remarkable progress with the estate accounts, uncovering the full extent of the previous steward's theft and helping Julian pursue proper legal action against the man, who was eventually located in a neighboring county and forced to return a significant portion of the stolen funds. With the immediate financial crisis resolved, Clara turned her attention to longer-term improvements, proposing changes to how tenant rents were collected and recorded, suggestions that Julian, to his own surprise, found himself implementing without hesitation, trusting her judgment more completely than he had trusted anyone else's counsel in years. One afternoon, a crisis arose among the tenant farms that tested both of their characters in ways neither had anticipated. Heavy rains had flooded several of the low-lying fields, destroying crops that tenant families depended on for the coming winter. Word reached the main house that one family in particular, the Coopers, had lost nearly everything, their small cottage damaged by the flooding and their harvest ruined entirely. Julian's first instinct, shaped by years of managing the estate according to strict financial principles, was to offer the standard relief allotted for such circumstances, a modest sum meant to help tenant families recover, without setting a precedent that might be seen as excessive generosity. Clara, however, argued fiercely against this approach. "They have lost everything," she said, standing before his desk with a fire in her eyes that Julian found both alarming and captivating. "A modest sum will not rebuild a cottage or replace a season's harvest. If you do not help them properly now, they will fall into debt themselves, and you will lose reliable tenants who have worked this land faithfully for generations." Julian studied her for a long moment, weighing her words against the practical concerns of estate management that had been drilled into him since childhood. "And what would you have me do instead?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than dismissive. "Rebuild the cottage properly," Clara said without hesitation. "Provide seed and supplies for next season's planting. Extend them credit against future rents if necessary, but do not let a family who has served this estate faithfully collapse because of one bad season brought on by weather they could not control." It was a costly proposal, and Julian knew it. But something in Clara's passionate defense of the Cooper family struck a chord he had not expected. A reminder that the estate existed not merely as columns of figures in a ledger, but as a community of people who depended on his decisions for their survival. He thought of his father's teachings, of duty and legacy, and realized, perhaps for the first time, that true duty meant more than protecting wealth. It meant protecting the people who made that wealth possible. "Very well," he said finally. "Draw up the proposal. We will do as you suggest." Clara's face broke into a smile so genuine and relieved that Julian found himself unable to look away. In that moment, standing in his study with rain still tapping softly against the windows outside, he understood with sudden, undeniable clarity that his feelings for Clara Bennett had grown far beyond mere admiration for her skill or gratitude for her work. He was falling in love with her, deeply and completely, in a way he had never anticipated and did not entirely know how to navigate. The Cooper family's cottage was rebuilt within weeks, and word of the Duke's generosity spread quietly through the tenant community, earning him a loyalty and respect that no amount of careful financial management could have purchased. Clara, watching the family move back into their repaired home, felt a quiet pride settle in her chest, knowing that her voice had made a genuine difference in the lives of people who had no other advocate to speak for them. That evening, walking back toward the main house together after inspecting the completed repairs, Julian and Clara found themselves alone on a path bordered by autumn trees, the last golden light of the day filtering through branches overhead. Neither of them spoke for a long while, comfortable in a silence that had grown easier between them with each passing week. "You surprised me today," Julian said finally, breaking the quiet. "Most people in your position would have simply followed my initial instructions without argument." "I am not most people," Clara replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "No," Julian agreed, his voice softer now, more serious. "You certainly are not." He stopped walking, and Clara stopped beside him, turning to face him with a question forming in her expression. The autumn light caught the color in her cheeks, and for a moment, neither of them moved, caught in a silence that felt heavier and more meaningful than any conversation they had shared before. "Clara," Julian said, her name sounding different in his voice than it ever had before, softer, more careful, as though he were handling something fragile and precious. "Your Grace," she began, but he shook his head slightly. "Julian," he corrected gently. "Please, at least when we are alone like this." "Julian," she repeated, and something in the way she said his name seemed to settle a decision in him that he had been circling for weeks without quite admitting to himself. "I know this is complicated," he said. "I know what I said about you, that night, and I know how much distance still exists between what society expects of me and what I find myself wanting instead. But I cannot pretend any longer that my feelings for you are simply gratitude for your work here." Clara's heart pounded fiercely in her chest, hope and fear tangled together in equal measure. She had allowed herself, in quiet, unguarded moments, to imagine this conversation happening, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt both wonderful and terrifying, given everything that stood between them. His rank, her circumstances, the very public humiliation that had first brought them together. "I do not know what to say," she admitted honestly. "You do not need to say anything yet," Julian replied. "I only wanted you to know the truth. Whatever happens next, I wanted you to understand how much you have changed my understanding of what truly matters." They stood together a while longer beneath the golden autumn trees, the weight of unspoken possibility hanging between them, before finally continuing their walk back to the house, in a silence that felt entirely different from any silence they had shared before, charged now with something neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, but both of them undeniably felt. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from a distance, tucked discreetly behind a stand of trees near the estate's boundary wall, Lady Vivian Thorne had come to Wren Hall under the pretense of a social call to Lady Eleanor, but she had wandered the grounds afterward, drawn by curiosity and suspicion, and what she witnessed confirmed every fear she had carried since her conversation with the Dowager weeks earlier. The Duke was in love with his steward, and Vivian Thorne, watching the tender scene unfold from the shadows, felt her calculated patience finally give way to cold, determined resolve. She would not allow a woman like Clara Bennet to steal the future Vivian had spent years carefully constructing for herself. Whatever it took, however far she needed to go, Vivian intended to ensure that Julian Ashford's foolish infatuation ended before it could ever reach the altar. She turned and walked back toward her waiting carriage, already forming the first threads of a plan that would soon threaten to destroy everything Clara had worked so hard to build. Vivian Thorne moved with the same careful precision she applied to everything in her life. She did not act out of blind anger, but with the cold, methodical patience of someone who understood that a well-placed lie, delivered at the right moment to the right audience, could accomplish far more damage than any public confrontation ever could. She began by cultivating a friendship with a maid at Wren Hall named Susan Fell, a young woman recently dismissed from her position after being caught pilfering small items from the household. Susan harbored no small amount of resentment toward Clara Bennet, believing, incorrectly, that Clara's investigation into household matters had contributed to her dismissal, when in truth Susan's own carelessness had been entirely responsible. Vivian found in Susan's bitterness exactly the tool she needed. Over several careful meetings, disguised as simple charity toward a dismissed servant, Vivian coaxed from Susan every small detail she could recall about Clara's time at Wren Hall, twisting innocent moments into something far more scandalous. A private conversation between Clara and the Duke became, in Vivian's careful retelling, evidence of an affair conducted under the guise of a state business. An evening when Clara had stayed later than usual to finish urgent accounting work became, in Vivian's fabricated narrative, a secret rendezvous designed to seduce the Duke into marriage for the sake of Clara's family fortune. Vivian paid Susan generously for a signed statement, carefully worded to suggest impropriety, without ever stating an outright lie that could be easily disproven, a document crafted with the same careful precision Vivian applied to every aspect of her scheme. She then began circulating whispers through the social circles she moved within, planting seeds of doubt and scandal in conversations that would eventually reach every household of consequence in the county. The rumors spread with devastating speed. Within days, whispers reached Clara's own mother, who received a cold, pointed letter from a distant acquaintance, suggesting that Clara's employment at Wren Hall had become the subject of scandalous gossip throughout society. Margaret Bennet, already fragile from years of financial worry, was devastated by the implications, fearing that her daughter's reputation, and by extension the entire family's remaining standing, had been irreparably damaged. Clara herself learned of the rumors from Louisa Pratt, who came to her with visible distress one morning, explaining, in halting words, what was being said throughout the county. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she listened, understanding immediately the devastating implications of such rumors, not merely for her own reputation, but for her family's already precarious standing. Who would spread such lies? She asked, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. Louisa did not know for certain, though she suspected, given the timing and the calculated cruelty of the rumors, that someone with both motive and resources had orchestrated the entire scheme deliberately. Clara thought immediately of Lady Vivian Thorne, remembering vague mentions of the woman's interest in the Duke, though she had no proof, nothing concrete enough to defend herself against whispers that spread faster than any truth could hope to catch up with. The matter reached its devastating peak at a garden party hosted by a prominent family in the county, an event that both Julian and Clara, along with much of society, attended. Clara had debated not attending at all, fearing the reception she might receive, but Julian had insisted, arguing that hiding from the accusations would only lend them false credibility. "We will face this together," he told her the morning of the party, his expression resolute. "I will not let baseless rumors dictate how either of us lives our lives." Clara had drawn strength from his confidence, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of walking into that garden party and feeling the weight of every judgmental stare, every whispered conversation that fell suddenly silent as she passed, every carefully averted gaze from women who had once greeted her politely enough during her rare social outings. Lady Vivian, dressed exquisitely and moving through the gathering with practiced ease, orchestrated the confrontation with the same careful precision she had applied to everything else. She waited until Clara stood near the center of the garden, surrounded by enough witnesses to guarantee maximum humiliation, before approaching with a cold, triumphant smile. "Miss Bennet," Vivian said, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. "How brave of you to show your face here, given everything that has been said about your conduct at Wren Hall." Clara felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward her, the garden falling into an uncomfortable, expectant silence. "I do not know what you have heard, Lady Vivian," Clara replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. "But I can assure you that nothing improper has occurred during my employment." Vivian's smile sharpened. "That is not what I have been told," she said, producing, with theatrical precision, the signed statement she had purchased from Susan Fell. "A former servant of Wren Hall has provided a detailed account of your conduct with the Duke, conduct that I think everyone here would agree is entirely inappropriate for a woman in your position." Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd as Vivian read aloud select portions of the fabricated statement, twisting innocent moments into something scandalous, her voice dripping with false sympathy even as she delivered each devastating accusation. Clara stood frozen, humiliation and fury warring within her, acutely aware that Julian stood only a short distance away, his expression darkening with each word Vivian spoke. "This is a lie," Clara finally managed to say, her voice shaking now despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I have done nothing improper. My work at Wren Hall has been entirely professional." "And yet," Vivian said smoothly, turning to address the gathered crowd rather than Clara directly, "everyone here can see how the Duke watches her, how he has changed since her arrival. Draw your own conclusions, ladies and gentlemen, about what such devotion truly means." The crowd murmured, some faces sympathetic toward Clara, others openly skeptical, whispering behind gloved hands about the scandal that seemed, moment by moment, to solidify into accepted truth simply through repetition, and Vivian's confident delivery. Julian, watching the scene unfold, felt torn between fury at Vivian's cruel manipulation and a paralyzing uncertainty about how best to defend Clara without further inflaming the scandal. He stepped forward finally, his voice carrying the authority of his rank across the silent garden. "That is enough," he said, his tone hard and commanding. "Lady Vivian, you will retract these baseless accusations immediately." Vivian, however, had prepared for this moment as carefully as every other aspect of her scheme. "Your Grace," she said, her voice softening into false concern, "I understand this is difficult to hear, but surely you must see how your own behavior has fueled these rumors. A duke does not spend such private time with his steward without consequence to both their reputations." Julian hesitated. It was only a moment, a brief flicker of uncertainty as he weighed his genuine feelings for Clara against the crushing weight of societal expectation and the very real damage such a public scandal could inflict on his family's name. But that moment of hesitation, brief as it was, did not go unnoticed. Clara saw it clearly, the flash of doubt crossing his face, and something inside her chest cracked painfully at the sight. "He does not deny it," someone in the crowd whispered, loud enough for Clara to hear. Clara did not wait to hear anything more. She turned and walked from the garden with as much dignity as she could gather, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in public, the second time in a matter of months that she had been forced to walk away from a room full of judgmental faces, humiliated by circumstances entirely beyond her control. Julian called after her, but she did not turn back, and by the time he managed to extract himself from the stunned crowd and Vivian's continued false sympathy, Clara had already disappeared into a waiting carriage, leaving Wren Hall's grounds far behind her. That evening, Clara sat in her family's modest parlor, her mother's worried face across from her, Alice still recovering slowly in the next room, and felt the full weight of everything she had built over the past months threatening to collapse entirely. Her reputation, once merely damaged by the Duke's careless words at a ball, now stood at the center of a scandal that could destroy any hope of respectable marriage or continued employment anywhere in the county. She thought of Julian's hesitation in the garden, that brief, telling pause before he spoke in her defense, and wondered, with a hollow ache in her chest, whether his feelings for her had truly been as genuine as he claimed, or whether the pressure of society's judgment would ultimately prove stronger than whatever affection had grown between them during her months at Wren Hall. "I should never have accepted that position," Clara whispered to her mother, exhaustion and heartbreak evident in every word. "I have only brought more shame upon this family." Margaret Bennet reached across the small table and took her daughter's hand firmly in her own. "You have brought nothing but honor to this family," she said fiercely. "Whatever lies that woman has spread, they are lies, and lies eventually crumble beneath the weight of truth. You must not lose faith in yourself, Clara, whatever happens next." But as Clara lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of her small bedroom, she could not shake the image of Julian's hesitation, nor the fear that perhaps, in the end, a duke's duty to his name would always outweigh whatever fragile, complicated love had grown between them during those quiet months at Wren Hall. Julian did not sleep that night. He paced the length of his study for hours, replaying the scene in the garden over and over in his mind, his own hesitation echoing louder with each pass than anything Vivian Thorne had said. He had frozen, if only for a moment, and that moment had been enough to drive Clara away, enough to make her doubt everything he had told her beneath the golden autumn trees only weeks earlier. He understood, with growing clarity as the night wore on, that his hesitation had not come from any true doubt about his feelings for Clara. It had come from fear, an old, deeply ingrained fear of disappointing his family's name, of failing to live up to the duty his father had drilled into him since childhood. But standing there in the empty study, surrounded by the very ledgers Clara had spent months carefully organizing, ledgers that told the story of an estate finally beginning to thrive because of her skill and dedication, Julian realized that his fear had cost him something far more valuable than any reputation could ever be worth. He resolved, before the sun rose, that he would uncover the truth behind Vivian's accusations and clear Clara's name completely, whatever it took. His first step was to speak directly with Susan Fell, the dismissed maid whose signed statement had formed the foundation of Vivian's cruel scheme. He located her lodgings in the nearby town through careful inquiry among the household staff, and arrived at her door early the following morning, his presence alone enough to unsettle the young woman considerably. Susan initially insisted the statement she had given was entirely truthful, but Julian's calm, patient questioning gradually revealed inconsistencies in her account, details that did not match the timeline of Clara's actual employment, moments she claimed to have witnessed personally that Julian knew, from his own memory, could not have occurred as she described them. Finally, faced with the Duke's steady, unrelenting gaze, Susan broke down and confessed the truth. Lady Vivian Thorne had approached her weeks earlier, offering generous payment in exchange for a statement crafted to imply scandal. A statement Vivian herself had largely written, with Susan merely signing her name to accusations she knew, even as she signed them, contained more fabrication than fact. "I am sorry, Your Grace," Susan said, tears streaming down her face. "I needed the money desperately, and Lady Vivian made it sound as though no real harm would come from it, only gossip that would fade eventually." Julian felt fury rise sharply within him, though he kept his voice controlled as he asked Susan whether she would be willing to sign a new statement, this time telling the complete truth about Vivian's involvement in fabricating the entire scandal. Susan, clearly relieved to unburden herself of the guilt she had carried since the garden party, agreed readily, and within the hour, Julian possessed a signed confession that would unravel every lie Vivian had so carefully constructed. He did not go immediately to confront Vivian, however. His first priority was Clara and the damage his hesitation had caused between them. He rode directly to the Bennett family home, arriving unannounced just as the morning sun climbed fully above the horizon. Margaret Bennett answered the door herself, her expression guarded when she recognized the Duke standing on her modest doorstep. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am not certain my daughter wishes to speak with you at present." "Please," Julian said, his voice carrying genuine humility rather than any trace of his former arrogance. "I understand if she does not wish to see me. But I have uncovered proof that the accusations against her were entirely fabricated, orchestrated by Lady Vivian Thorne out of jealousy and calculated cruelty. I need to make this right, both for Clara's sake and because I owe her an apology I should have offered the moment those lies were spoken." Margaret studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity, before finally stepping aside and allowing him entry. Clara stood in the small parlor when he entered, her expression carefully guarded, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes, from a night spent in restless, heartbroken sleeplessness. "You should not have come here," she said, though her voice lacked true conviction behind the words. "I could not stay away," Julian replied honestly. "Clara, I have proof. Susan Fell has confessed everything. Lady Vivian paid her to fabricate that statement, twisting innocent moments from your time at Wren Hall into something scandalous that never actually occurred. I have her signed confession here, and I intend to make certain the entire county knows the truth before this day ends." Clara's carefully guarded expression wavered slightly, hope and lingering hurt warring visibly across her features. "That does not change what happened in that garden," she said quietly. "You hesitated, Julian. In front of everyone, when I needed you to defend me without doubt, you hesitated." Julian crossed the small room and stood before her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way Clara had never seen from him before, not even during their most private conversations at Wren Hall. "You are right," he said. "I hesitated, and I will regret that moment for the rest of my life. But it was not because I doubted you, or doubted my feelings for you. It was because I was afraid of disappointing a legacy that has controlled every decision I have ever made, afraid of choosing my own happiness over the expectations placed on me since before I could even understand what those expectations truly meant." He paused, gathering his thoughts, before continuing more firmly. "But standing in that garden, watching you walk away, I understood something I should have understood weeks ago. That legacy means nothing to me if it costs me you. I would rather face every judgmental whisper in this county, every disapproving glance from every family who believes I have married beneath my station, than spend one more day pretending that duty matters more than genuine happiness." Clara felt tears finally beginning to fall, tears she had held back through every humiliation, every scandal, every sleepless night since this entire ordeal began. Julian reached out gently, his hand hovering near her face without quite touching her, silently asking permission she granted with the smallest of nods. "I love you," he said, the words falling into the quiet parlor with unmistakable sincerity. "I have loved you since long before I fully understood what that feeling meant, since watching you defend a servant girl with no thought for your own advantage, since seeing you argue passionately for a tenant family's welfare against my own initial instincts. I was a fool that night at the ball, and I have been fighting against my own foolishness ever since, trying to reconcile who I was raised to be with who I actually want to become. I choose you, Clara. Whatever it costs me, I choose you." Clara's tears fell freely now, though her expression had shifted from heartbreak into something far more hopeful. "I love you too," she admitted quietly. "I have tried so hard not to, tried to protect myself from exactly this kind of heartbreak, but I cannot deny it any longer, not after everything we have shared these past months." Julian gently wiped a tear from her cheek, his touch tender and careful. "Then let me make this right," he said. "Let me clear your name completely, and let me prove to you, and to everyone who has ever doubted either of us, that my feelings for you are not some passing infatuation, but a love I intend to honor for the rest of my life." That very afternoon, Julian returned to Wren Hall and immediately summoned Lady Vivian Thorne to a private meeting, presenting her with Susan Fell's signed confession and making clear, in no uncertain terms, that her scheme had been thoroughly uncovered. Vivian, faced with irrefutable evidence of her deception, attempted first to deny involvement, then to justify her actions as concern for the Duke's reputation, but Julian remained unmoved by her increasingly desperate excuses. "You will issue a full public retraction," he said, his voice cold and final. "You will confirm, before the same society you humiliated Clara in front of, that every accusation you made was fabricated entirely from your own jealousy and cruelty. If you refuse, I will see to it that Susan Fell's confession is made public regardless, along with the full truth of how you paid her to lie. Either way, the truth will come out, Lady Vivian. The only question is whether you retain any shred of dignity in how it does so." Vivian, recognizing she had no genuine alternative, agreed reluctantly to Julian's terms, her carefully constructed schemes finally collapsing under the weight of her own deception. Within days, word spread through the county that the accusations against Clara Bennett had been entirely fabricated, orchestrated by a jealous rival desperate to prevent the Duke's genuine affection from developing into something permanent. The same social circles that had whispered scandalous rumors now whispered instead about the depth of the Duke's devotion, about how far he had gone to clear the reputation of a woman he had once so carelessly dismissed. Clara's name, rather than remaining tainted by scandal, emerged from the ordeal stronger than before, respected not only for her skill and competence, but now for the genuine affection of a Duke who had proven, through decisive action, that his feelings ran far deeper than mere infatuation. Clara returned to Wren Hall the following week, no longer merely as a steward managing accounts, but as a woman whose heart had been fully claimed by the man who employed her, and whose own heart had claimed his in return. As she walked through the familiar doors once more, she felt, for the first time since that humiliating night at the ball so many months earlier, that the future finally held genuine promise rather than mere survival. Julian met her in the entrance hall, his expression lighting with unmistakable joy at her arrival. "Welcome home," he said softly, and Clara understood, hearing those words, that Wren Hall had indeed become something far more meaningful to her than mere employment. It had become the place where she had found not only vindication, but love, deep and genuine and hard-won. Exactly the kind of love that endures long after every scandal and hesitation has finally faded into memory. With Clara's reputation restored and their feelings finally spoken openly between them, Julian turned his attention toward a new resolve, one that had been building steadily within him since that emotional morning in the Bennett family parlor. He did not wish merely to court Clara quietly, allowing time and propriety to slowly heal the wounds society had inflicted upon her. He wanted, instead, to make a statement so bold and unmistakable that no one, ever again, could question the depth and sincerity of his devotion. He began by visiting Margaret Bennett privately, seeking her blessing with a humility that surprised even himself, given how far he had traveled from the arrogant young duke who had once dismissed her daughter so carelessly in a crowded ballroom. Margaret, seeing the genuine transformation in Julian's character, and recognizing the joy that had returned to her daughter's eyes since his renewed pursuit began, granted her blessing readily, tears of relief and happiness gathering in her own eyes as she did so. "I only ever wanted my daughter to find happiness," Margaret told him. "It seems, against every expectation I once held, that she has found it with you." Julian next sought out Edmund Caro, his closest friend, enlisting his help in planning something that would require careful coordination across the county, an event bold enough to erase entirely the memory of that humiliating night at the ball, replacing it instead with a memory Clara would treasure for the rest of her life. His plan required speed as much as boldness. Word of Vivian Thorne's disgrace had spread quickly, and Julian understood that the longer he waited to make his intentions known publicly, the more opportunity remained for further gossip or doubt to fester among the county's more skeptical residents. He resolved to act decisively, within days rather than weeks, determined to prove that his commitment to Clara was neither fleeting nor uncertain. He arranged for a grand assembly to be held that very Saturday evening, ostensibly a celebration marking the successful resolution of certain estate matters, though the true purpose remained known only to Julian, Edmund, and a small circle of trusted household staff who helped with the preparations. Invitations were sent to every family who had attended the original ball where Julian's careless words first wounded Clara so deeply, ensuring that the very same society which had witnessed her humiliation would now witness something entirely different. Clara, unaware of the full scope of Julian's planning, received an invitation of her own, delivered personally by Julian during one of his now frequent visits to her family home. "Will you attend as my guest?" he asked, his eyes carrying a warmth and hopeful anticipation that made Clara's heart flutter despite her uncertainty about what exactly he had planned. "Of course," she replied, though something in his expression told her that this particular evening would prove far more significant than any ordinary social gathering. Saturday evening arrived with a clear autumn sky, stars beginning to emerge as carriages rolled up the long drive toward Wren Hall, the very estate where Clara had first arrived as a steward seeking employment, and where she had since found far more than she ever anticipated. The grand ballroom, the same room where Julian had once declared he would never marry a woman like her, now glowed warmly with candlelight, flowers arranged carefully throughout the space, a quiet elegance replacing the harsh judgment that had once filled the room. Clara arrived dressed in a gown Julian had commissioned specifically for the occasion, a deep blue silk that complemented her coloring beautifully, a far cry from the modest, borrowed dress she had worn on that humiliating night months earlier. As she entered the ballroom on her mother's arm, she felt many of the same eyes that had once watched her humiliation, now watching her again, though the expressions this time carried curiosity rather than judgment, the county's collective memory of Vivian's exposed deception still fresh enough to color how they now regarded Clara's presence. Julian found her almost immediately, his expression lighting with unmistakable joy as he crossed the room to greet her, offering his arm with a formal bow that drew appreciative murmurs from nearby guests. "May I have this dance?" he asked, and Clara accepted, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began playing. They danced together for several songs, moving with an ease and comfort that spoke clearly to onlookers of a genuine, deep connection between them. Whispers spread through the room, not of scandal this time, but of romantic speculation, guests exchanging knowing glances as they observed the Duke's obvious devotion to the woman he had once so publicly dismissed. As the final notes of the third dance faded, Julian did not release Clara's hand as custom might have dictated. Instead, he led her toward the center of the ballroom, signaling to the orchestra to pause, and to Edmund Caro, who moved quietly to ensure every set of eyes in the room turned toward the Duke and the woman standing beside him. Julian's heart pounded fiercely as he turned to face the gathered assembly, Clara's hand still held gently in his own. "Many of you were present," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom, "months ago, when I said something in this very room that I have regretted deeply ever since. I declared, carelessly and cruelly, that I would never marry a woman like Clara Bennett. A murmur rippled through the crowd, memories of that original scene clearly resurfacing among those who had witnessed it firsthand. Clara felt her cheeks flush, uncertain where Julian intended to take this public acknowledgement, though she trusted him completely, more completely than she had ever trusted anyone outside her own family. I was wrong, Julian continued, his voice growing steadier and more resolute with each word. I was wrong about everything I believed that night. I judged Clara based on assumptions about wealth and standing that meant absolutely nothing about her true character, her intelligence, her courage, or her capacity for love. Since that night, I have watched this remarkable woman uncover theft that had drained my estate for years, defend an innocent servant against false accusations without any thought for her own advantage, fight tirelessly for tenant families who had no other voice to speak on their behalf, and endure with grace and dignity a scandal that would have broken far weaker people entirely. He turned to face Clara directly now, his expression open and vulnerable before the entire gathered assembly. Clara Bennett is not simply a woman worthy of marrying a duke, he said. She is a woman who has taught this duke what true worth actually means, worth measured not in fortune or title, but in character, kindness, and courage. I was a fool to ever suggest otherwise, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving how completely wrong I was. Gasps and murmurs of astonishment rippled through the ballroom as Julian lowered himself slowly to one knee before Clara, producing from his coat pocket a ring that caught the candlelight beautifully. Its design elegant yet understated. Exactly the kind of thoughtful choice Clara would have expected from the man who had learned, over these past months, to truly understand her heart. Clara Bennett, he said, his voice thick with emotion despite his best efforts to remain composed before the watching crowd. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you allow me to spend every remaining day of my life proving that the words I once spoke about you were the greatest mistake of my life, and that my love for you now is the truest thing I have ever known? Tears streamed freely down Clara's face as she looked down at Julian, at the sincerity and hope written so plainly across his features, at the ring glinting between them, and at the countless faces surrounding them, waiting breathlessly for her answer. She thought of her mother's quiet sacrifices, of Alice's slow recovery, of every humiliation and hardship that had brought her to this exact moment, standing in the very ballroom where her greatest public shame had once occurred, now transformed into the setting for her greatest joy. Yes, she said, her voice breaking slightly with overwhelming emotion. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. The ballroom erupted into applause and joyful exclamations as Julian rose to his feet, slipping the ring onto Clara's trembling finger, before pulling her into an embrace that spoke more powerfully than any words could of the depth of feeling between them. Margaret Bennett, watching from nearby with tears streaming freely down her own face, felt every year of worry and desperate hope finally give way to overwhelming relief and happiness for her daughter's future. Julian, ever decisive once his mind was firmly set, wasted no time in arranging the wedding itself. Special license in hand within days, he insisted that their marriage take place as swiftly as propriety would allow, determined that nothing, no lingering doubt, no possibility of further scandal or interference, would delay the union he had waited far too long to claim. The wedding took place that very Sunday, in the small chapel on the Wren Hall estate, attended by close family and friends rather than the grand society assembly that had witnessed their engagement. Clara wore a simple, elegant gown, her mother and sister Alice, now fully recovered from her illness, standing proudly among the small gathering of witnesses. Lady Eleanor Ashford, the Duke's aunt, wept openly with joy throughout the ceremony, having watched with quiet delight as her nephew transformed from a rigid, duty-bound young man into someone capable of choosing love over legacy, understanding at last that the two need not remain forever opposed. As Julian and Clara exchanged their vows before the small altar, sunlight streaming through the chapel's stained glass windows, Clara found herself thinking back to that terrible night months earlier, when Julian's careless words had wounded her so deeply in front of an entire ballroom. She marveled at how completely their story had transformed since then, from public humiliation to public celebration, from careless dismissal to devoted love, proving beyond any doubt that first impressions, however painful, need not determine the final chapter of any story. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, Julian kissed his new duchess with a tenderness that spoke to everything they had endured together to reach this moment, and the small gathering erupted into joyful applause, celebrating a union that had defied every expectation society once held about who a duke should marry, and proving instead that true worth, true love, and true happiness could be found in the most unexpected of places, waiting only for someone brave enough to recognize it. A year passed, and Wren Hall had transformed into a household unlike anything the county had witnessed under previous generations of Ashford dukes. Where once the estate had been managed by careless stewards and increasingly distant landowners, it now thrived under the careful joint attention of Julian and his Duchess, who continued to apply her sharp mind and generous heart to matters both financial and personal. Clara had not abandoned her love of numbers and careful management simply because marriage had elevated her status. Instead, she and Julian worked together as true partners, reviewing estate matters side by side each week, Clara's practical wisdom balancing Julian's broader vision for the estate's future. Tenant families who had once feared neglect now found themselves supported by a household that genuinely cared for their welfare, and word of the Duke and Duchess's fair, generous management spread throughout neighboring counties, drawing admiration from unexpected quarters. The same society that had once whispered scandalous rumors about Clara now spoke of her with genuine respect and warmth. Invitations to Wren Hall became highly sought after, and Clara, rather than shrinking from her new position of prominence, embraced it fully, using her influence to advocate for causes that mattered deeply to her, particularly the welfare of servants and tenant families who so often went unheard within the rigid structures of society. Margaret Bennet, no longer burdened by crushing debt or constant worry, moved into a comfortable cottage on the Wren Hall estate, close enough to see her daughter regularly, yet independent enough to maintain her own quiet dignity. She spent her days now in peaceful contentment, watching her daughter's happiness unfold with a satisfaction that erased years of hardship and worry from her weathered features. Alice, fully recovered and thriving, grew into a spirited young woman under the security and opportunity that Clara's marriage had provided the entire family. She often visited Wren Hall, delighting in long conversations with her sister, and growing increasingly close to Julian, who treated her with the same warmth and generosity he extended to every member of Clara's family, understanding deeply how much they had sacrificed and endured before fortune finally smiled upon them. Lady Eleanor Ashford remained a frequent and beloved presence at Wren Hall, her initial fondness for Clara having deepened into genuine familial affection. She often remarked with a knowing smile that she had suspected from their very first meeting that Clara possessed exactly the qualities Julian needed in a partner, qualities his own father, focused so singularly on legacy and status, had entirely overlooked in raising his son. As for Lady Vivian Thorne, her reputation, once so carefully cultivated through years of calculated social maneuvering, never fully recovered from the exposure of her scheme against Clara. She eventually left the county entirely, seeking a fresh start elsewhere, far from the whispers and judgment that followed her wherever she went. Clara, despite everything Vivian had put her through, found herself feeling not triumphant satisfaction at her rival's downfall, but a quiet, complicated pity for a woman who had allowed jealousy and fear to drive her toward such destructive cruelty. Julian, for his part, continued to grow into the role of Duke in ways that would have surprised the careless young man who once spoke so thoughtlessly at that fateful ball. He remained devoted to Clara in every visible way, their partnership becoming something of a quiet legend throughout the county, spoken of admiringly by those who witnessed how genuinely they supported and championed one another, both publicly and in the quiet moments no one else ever saw. On the anniversary of their wedding, Julian arranged a small, intimate celebration at Wren Hall, gathering close family and friends for an evening far removed from the grand, dramatic proposal that had marked their engagement the previous year. As the evening drew to a close, and guests began departing into the cool autumn night, Julian found himself alone with Clara on the same terrace where she had once stood, humiliated and heartbroken, following his careless words at that original ball so many months earlier. "Do you remember standing here?" he asked softly, "that first night, after everything I said?" Clara nodded, memories of that painful evening still vivid, despite everything that had transformed since then. "I remember thinking I hated you completely," she admitted with a small, fond smile. Julian laughed softly, pulling her closer against him as they looked out over the moonlit grounds of Wren Hall, grounds that had witnessed both their darkest and brightest moments together. "I am endlessly grateful," he said, "that fate proved far wiser than my own foolish pride that night. I cannot imagine my life now without you beside me, Clara. You transformed not only this estate, but everything I once believed about duty, legacy, and love." Clara turned in his embrace, looking up at the man who had once wounded her so deeply, and who had since become the truest, most steadfast partner she had ever known. "And I cannot imagine mine without you," she replied softly, "though I suppose, in the end, I should thank you for those cruel words that night." Without them, perhaps our paths would never have crossed in quite the same way. Julian smiled, leaning down to press a gentle kiss against her forehead. Perhaps, he agreed, though I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never regret the path those cruel words eventually led us both toward. They stood together on that terrace for a long while, the same terrace where Clara had once gathered the strength to walk away from humiliation with her head held high, now standing instead, in the warm embrace of a love that had proven, beyond any doubt, that true worth could never be measured by fortune or title alone. Below them, the lights of Wren Hall glowed warmly in the darkness, a household transformed by love, by courage, and by two people brave enough to choose each other despite every obstacle society had placed between them. And throughout the county, whenever the story was told, of the Duke who once swore he would never marry a woman like her, only to place a ring on her finger within a single Sunday, it served as a lasting reminder that first words, however cruel or careless, need never determine the final chapter of any story, and that the truest love often arrives disguised as the very thing we once swore, with absolute certainty, we would never want at all.